That weekend started off like any other. Avery had her bags packed and was ready to meet up with Dana and Mel in Denver, a ski trip they had been planning for months. She almost cancelled when Noah, her husband, casually mentioned a family gathering at the lake. He described it as something simple, just a few people, nothing formal. Avery hesitated for a second, but pushed the doubt aside. She was used to staying out of the way, to not making things complicated. When she asked if she should go with him, Noah smiled and said, "It's just a brother thing, babe. You go enjoy the mountains." And like many times before, she let it go. They arrived at the ski resort on Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, fresh snow, and that kind of stillness you only find in the mountains. Avery hadn't realized how much she needed that silence. For months, she'd been feeling worn out, disconnected, like she was fading inside her own marriage. Noah's family had never really embraced her. They were polite, yes, but never warm. She was always his wife, never truly part of them. No one asked her to help with preparations. No one brought her into inside jokes or family decisions. Over time, she had come to accept those small exclusions as normal, until they stopped feeling small. On Saturday morning after breakfast, Avery stayed behind in the hotel room while Dana took a shower. She was relaxed, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram, not looking for anything in particular. That's when she saw it, a perfectly lit photo of a lavishly decorated venue. Golden lights, floral arrangements, and a massive table centerpiece. Front and center stood Noah, holding a microphone and giving a toast beside his younger brother, both of them beaming, surrounded by applause. The location wasn't just any lake, it was an upscale resort not even an hour outside the city. And the caption made it crystal clear, this wasn't a family gathering, it was an engagement party. At first, Avery froze. Her mind tried to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. She went back to the photo, then swiped to see the others. There they were, Noah's parents, cousins, childhood friends, even people she hadn't seen in years. Everyone, except her. Her chest started to tighten. She stood up from the bed and began pacing around the room, trying to keep herself from crying. But she knew. This wasn't a miscommunication or a forgotten invitation. Noah had lied. He had deliberately left her out of one of the most important events in his family's life, and he didn't even have the decency to admit it. Hours later, still trying to process the shock, Avery joined Dana and Mel for a ski run. She didn't say anything at first. Part of her was still hoping there was some kind of explanation that would make it all hurt less. But as they rode the lift up the mountain, with the wind cutting against her face and an unbearable silence hanging between them, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She handed her phone to Mel, showing the photos without a word. Mel scrolled through them slowly, then looked up at Avery with wide, stunned eyes. "Is this the family gathering he mentioned?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. That's when Avery broke down. Not loudly, just quiet, trembling sobs that had been building up for months. That night, back in their cabin, Avery posted a photo of herself standing on the mountain lookout, facing away from the camera with her arms crossed, surrounded by snow and open sky. The caption was simple, no tags, no names. Turns out the mountains were more welcoming than some families. She locked her phone without thinking twice. She wasn't looking for attention. She just needed to let something out before she collapsed from the weight of it all. What she didn't expect was for that post to explode. Within hours, comments started flooding in, from friends, co-workers, even people she hadn't spoken to in years. And they all knew exactly what she meant, without her ever having to say it directly. By Sunday morning, Avery's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, she thought about ignoring it, but something told her it wasn't just the usual notifications. When she finally unlocked the screen, she was hit with dozens of messages, tags, screenshots, DMs. Some of them were from mutual friends asking if everything was okay. Others simply said things like, "I always knew something felt off about the way they treated you." One colleague messaged her, "Your post made me cry. I went through the same thing with my ex's family. Thank you for putting it into words." Avery sat with her phone in her hands for a long moment. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. But with the support came the backlash. Noah had called her 3 times. Then came a long, drawn-out text blaming her for making a public scene, accusing her of humiliating his family and blowing things out of proportion. She didn't answer. She didn't have the energy to play his game. But buried in his message was the part that hit the hardest. "You know my mom didn't want you there, and I didn't want to start a fight that night." There it was. No excuses, no misunderstandings. He knew. He accepted it. He let it happen. Not just quietly, but willingly. And that single admission shattered something inside Avery that she couldn't put back together. When she got back from the trip, Noah was waiting at home. There were no real apologies, just defensive explanations, empty rationalizations, and a string of sentences that all began with, "But you also." Avery didn't yell. She just stood there, listening, watching him twist himself into circles, trying to reframe the truth. At one point, he said she had always been too sensitive about his family. That's when it clicked. She wasn't crazy. For years, they had made her feel like she was imagining things when all she wanted was to be included, to be treated like she mattered. And in that moment, she knew. Nothing about their relationship would ever be the same again. That night, without drama or confrontation, she started packing a few essentials. She called Mel and asked if she could stay for a few days. Mel didn't hesitate. When Avery arrived at her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch, still wearing her coat, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe. She didn't cry. Not that night. There was something else building inside her, something quiet, but powerful. It felt like freedom. Mel handed her a blanket and a cup of tea without asking questions. She didn't need to. Avery didn't want to explain anything. She just needed space, silence, and the quiet certainty that, even though it hurt, she had made the right decision. The next morning, as she sipped coffee in Mel's kitchen, Avery checked her phone again. Her post was still spreading, but now the messages hitting her inbox had shifted. Women from all over were sharing their own stories, being excluded from family events, treated like outsiders, made to feel like guests in their own marriages. Some had been left out of weddings, birthdays, even funerals. Avery read each one with her heart in her throat. She wasn't alone. She wasn't being dramatic. There were so many others who had lived in that same kind of silence, trying to smile through the sting of never really belonging. Alongside those stories came messages from people she never expected to hear from. A distant cousin of Noah's apologized for never speaking up. One of his aunts admitted that she always knew how Avery was being treated, but didn't think it was her place to intervene. Even one of Noah's exes reached out to say she had gone through something almost identical. The messages didn't erase the pain, but they validated her experience. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't exaggerated. For years, she tried to force herself into a place that was never meant to make room for her. And now, understanding that, finally, fully, was the beginning of letting go. That week, Avery took a few days off from work. Not because she was falling apart, but because she knew she needed time to sit with it all, to breathe, to stop pretending she was fine. Back at the apartment she had shared with Noah, everything felt strange. Even the coffee mug she used every morning felt foreign. The framed photos, the throw pillows, the neatly folded blankets. All of it looked like it belonged to someone else's life. At Mel's place, things were different. Simpler. She started cooking again, reading without checking the time, even laughing without second-guessing herself. Slowly, she was reconnecting with pieces of herself she hadn't touched in years. One afternoon, while walking through the park near Mel's apartment, Avery got a call from a design company she had worked with years ago. They'd seen her post, not because of the drama, but because of how deeply it had resonated with people. They wanted to offer her a monthly column focused on the emotional side of interior design. Avery paused for a moment, then said yes. It was the first time in ages that someone wanted her for who she really was, not for who she was attached to. And just like that, her pain began to shift into something else, something useful, something that could help others feel less invisible. One night, while sorting through her things and deciding what to keep, Avery found a box tucked in the back of her closet. Inside were old letters, photos, and keepsakes from the early days with Noah, back when everything had felt more honest. Or at least, when she had believed it was. She sifted through the memories carefully. Looking at those photos didn't make her cry. Instead, they filled her with a kind of quiet detachment. It was like flipping through someone else's story. That version of her, the one who tried so hard to be accepted, to be enough, didn't exist anymore. And realizing that didn't bring sadness. It brought clarity. Not long after, Mel suggested they take a weekend trip back to the mountains, the same place where everything had unraveled. Avery hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to face it again. But something inside her whispered that it was time. The resort looked just as it had weeks before, but Avery wasn't the same woman who had stood there frozen, staring at her phone. She climbed to the lookout spot where she'd taken that now famous photo and stood quietly, breathing in the crisp air. She didn't need closure. She didn't need revenge. What she needed, and finally had, was peace. And in that moment, she knew she had come full circle. After the trip, Avery rented a small studio apartment near her new job, writing the monthly column. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She picked every piece of furniture herself. Soft curtains that let the morning light in, a cozy armchair for reading, plants that filled the space with life. Redecorating wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about reclaiming space. She had spent years shrinking herself to fit into other people's expectations. Now, for the first time in a long while, she was creating a home that reflected who she really was, not who she had tried to be for someone else. Her first column was about how spaces mirror our emotional lives. How sometimes a house can feel like a silent witness to everything we're too scared to say out loud. She didn't mention Noah or his family, but anyone who read between the lines could feel the weight of it. The article struck a chord. It went viral not because it was loud, but because it was real. People wrote to her in droves, strangers, friends, co-workers, all saying the same thing. I've lived that too. Avery read every message, and with each one she felt less alone, more grounded. Her pain wasn't just hers anymore. It had become something others could recognize in themselves. Over the following months, Noah made a few attempts to reach out. First, a couple of vague texts, then some missed calls. Eventually, he sent a long email filled with half apologies and a litany of "I didn't know how to handle it" excuses. But by then, it didn't sting the same way. Avery read the messages with a strange calm, not sadness, not for him, for the version of herself who once would have done anything just to feel accepted. That woman was gone. She no longer searched for closure in his words. She no longer needed an apology to validate her pain. His silence back then had been loud enough. There were still hard days, lonely weekends, quiet nights where the weight of it all crept in unexpectedly. Sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night, unsure what had stirred her. The memory of what happened, or just the habit of waking up with unrest. But even on those nights, she never once regretted leaving, because staying would have meant abandoning herself again and again. And now she knew. Healing wasn't a dramatic singular moment. It was a series of choices made daily to not shrink for the comfort of others. A year after everything unfolded, Avery was invited to speak at a wellness and emotional design conference. At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as a public figure or anyone particularly special. But then she thought about all the messages she'd received, the people who had seen their own stories reflected in hers. So she said yes. On stage, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. She didn't tell her story as a victim, but as someone who had finally learned to look in the mirror without flinching. She told the audience that sometimes the hardest space to occupy isn't a cold house or a judgmental family. It's a life where you don't feel welcome in your own skin. When she finished, the room stood and clapped, not because she was dramatic or polished, but because she was honest. Afterward, several attendees approached her. One older woman said, "It felt like you were telling my daughter's story." The one she never had the courage to say out loud. Another, younger, just took Avery's hand and squeezed it without speaking. As she left the conference hall, Avery didn't feel like a guest in her own life anymore. She hadn't healed everything, but she had turned her pain into something real. And in doing so, she'd helped others find their voice too. Sometime later, one of Noah's cousins sent her a private message. It was short, but sincere. "I just want to say what you did was brave. A lot of us saw how they treated you, but we stayed quiet. I'm sorry." Avery didn't reply right away. She wasn't sure how she felt. Part of her wanted to block out anything connected to that family, but another part of her recognized the weight those words carried. They didn't change the past, but they did close a small wound, the one of having been invisible even to those who knew the truth. That night, for the first time in a while, she fell asleep without tossing. No confusion, no replaying, conversations in her head, just rest. A few days later, she decided to return to the lake. Alone this time. No friends, no phone calls, no explanations. She rented a small cabin, walked the same trails, sat in front of the frozen water. She didn't go with a speech or some planned ritual. She just wanted to stand in that place again, not as someone betrayed, but as someone rebuilt. From her backpack, she pulled out a notebook and wrote a single sentence. "This is where I learned who I wasn't and started figuring out who I am." She closed the book, breathed in the cold air, and watched the sun disappear behind the peaks. She didn't need answers, just this. As time passed, Avery stopped framing her life around what she had lost. She no longer talked about Noah or his family, not in her columns, not in conversation, not even in passing thoughts. Her story had shifted. It wasn't about being excluded anymore. It was about choosing herself after being erased. People still asked her now, and then, if she'd ever forgiven him. She would answer simply, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about not carrying what wasn't hers. What he did was his choice. What she did after, that was hers. And of the two, only one had set her free. She never re-entered Noah's family circle. There was no reunion, no forced civility, no second chances. She didn't need them. When people tried to soften the past, saying things like, maybe it was all just a misunderstanding, or your post came off a little harsh, she didn't get angry. She just replied calmly, I wasn't the one who left myself out. That clarity stayed with her in the months that followed. Peace didn't come from tying up every loose end. It came from understanding that some stories aren't meant to be rewritten, just understood and left behind. When people ask Avery now what she learned from it all, she doesn't respond with cliches. She says she learned how to recognize the signs she once ignored. That love isn't supposed to feel like a constant test you're afraid of failing. That shrinking yourself to be tolerated is not the same as being loved. She learned that sometimes the most radical act of self-respect is leaving quietly, not to punish, not to prove anything, but to finally breathe. She doesn't need the world to clap for her choices. She just needs to live with herself. And now she can, fully, honestly, and without apology. That day, she saw the engagement post on Instagram felt like the end, but it turned out to be the beginning of clarity, of healing, of truth. There was no poetic justice, no movie moment, just quiet, steady steps toward a life she built on her own terms. Avery didn't scream her pain into the world. She simply told the truth, and in doing so, she gave others permission to tell theirs. In a world that demands silence for the sake of appearances, her choice to speak and then to walk away was the loudest, most powerful thing she could have done.